Thank you very much. I'm going to be talking this afternoon about the New York session. The purpose of the session in New York was to examine the failure of the United States and of the United Nations to properly consider breaches of international law on the part of Israel in respect of Palestine, and to consider the question whether this failure constituted a violation of international law and incurred international responsibility. Let me say at the outset that we had a very successful meeting, and something that really surprised me was that there was no protest outside the Cooper Hall where we met. There had been protests at both the London session and the Cape Town session, but it's interesting that there was no such protest in New York where one would most have expected it. And again, I have seen no protest today, which does suggest that perhaps the Zionist cause is aware of the fact that it has lost the moral high ground on these matters. The Russell Tribunal, in its New York session, heard over 20 witnesses from Palestine, Israel, and from other parts of the world, and they all testified about the failure of the United States and the United Nations in respect of violations of international law. The United Nations, the United States, and Israel were all invited to attend and to give evidence before the Russell Tribunal, but we received no replies from any of these states. We heard evidence for several days, and at the end of a very successful meeting, we concluded with a speech by Stefan Hessel in which he quoted beautifully a sonnet from Shakespeare, and I think many of us will remember that occasion in particular. As at previous sessions of the Russell Tribunal, a great emphasis was laid upon Israel's violations of international law. The purpose of the New York session was not, however, to emphasize these violations, but rather to consider the extent to which the United States and the United Nations were complicit in these violations of international law, either by their actions or by their inactions. Let me begin with the United States. We heard evidence that the United States had given considerable material and political support to Israel. Materially, it had supported Israel by contributing substantially to the budget of Israel, particularly in respect of military hardware. It had equipped Israel with the latest weapons, and very importantly, it had turned a blind eye to Israel's nuclear program. Politically, the United States has given support to Israel by obstructing the peace process and also by preventing the United Nations from taking action to enforce international law. It's important to stress that the Palestinian Authorities, since its inception, has taken the view that the key to a settlement in the Middle East is to be found in Washington. And so it has urged and pleaded with the United States to bring Israel to the negotiating table. But with the exception of a brief period under President Clinton, the United States has failed to bring Israel to the negotiating table. And this is largely because of the power of the Israeli lobby in the United States, which has tied the hands of both the President and the Congress. But to make matters worse, we heard that the United States, as the dominant member of the Quartet, the body that the Security Council of the United Nations has mandated with the promotion of the peace process, the United States has obstructed the working of the Quartet. We heard evidence that the United States had cast its veto on 43 occasions since 1972 to prevent condemnations of Israel's violations of international law. The following are some of the most important examples of the United States' failure to take action in support of international law, or rather to condone Israel's violations of international law, or on occasion to even encourage it. First of all, there's the question of settlements. The United States is on record as being opposed to Israel's settlement activity, and on occasion it has indeed supported resolutions in the Security Council. But more recently, when resolutions condemning Israel's settlement activity are most needed, the United States has not only remained silent, but it has cast its veto against any resolution condemning settlements. For instance, in February 2011, it condemned such a resolution. And it's quite clear that the Security Council has not bothered even to condemn the settlement activity in recent times, because it realizes that the United States will veto such action. So to a large extent, the United States must accept responsibility for the continued expansion of settlements and for allowing Israel to build a colonial empire and to practice apartheid in the occupied Palestinian territory. Then there is the wall. We all know about the wall that Israel is building largely in Palestinian territory. Initially, it was claimed that this wall was a security measure, but it's now become very clear that, in fact, it is a political wall and that it will constitute the future boundary between Israel and Palestine, if indeed a Palestinian state is ever created. So in other words, it's become very clear that the construction of the wall is simply an act of annexation and unlawful seizure of Palestinian territory. And in 2004, the International Court of Justice held that the wall was illegal, that Israel should dismantle the wall and should cease continued construction of the wall. But it's important to stress that the United States has never accepted the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice, despite the fact that the European Union and the United Nations have accepted this advisory opinion. The obvious body in the United Nations to ensure compliance with the advisory opinion is the quartet comprising the United Nations, the United States, the Russian Federation, and the European Union. But the United States is the dominant member of the quartet, and it has prevented the quartet from taking action to ensure compliance with the advisory opinion. In fact, the quartet has only, in passing on one occasion, even referred to the advisory opinion. It has simply ignored it, and in the process, this advisory opinion has been killed at the instance of the United States. Then there's the question of violations of international humanitarian law, particularly in the case of Operation Cast Lead, where you will recall that Gaza was subjected to a massive bombardment without any distinction being drawn between combatants and civilians. There was loss of life, civilian life, and massive destruction of property. War crimes and crimes against humanity were committed. Several credible fact-finding reports testify to this. But the United States made sure that the Security Council did not condemn Israel's action. The United States preferred to see Israel's action as legitimate self-defense, despite the grossly disproportionate attack on Gaza. And since then, the United States has used its influence successfully to prevent the International Criminal Court from prosecuting Israel's political and military leaders for this action. Finally, there's the question of self-determination and statehood. We know that the United States was responsible for blocking Palestine's admission to the United Nations in 2011, and again last year when the General Assembly was able to adopt a resolution according non-member observer status to Palestine. The United States did its best, fortunately unsuccessful, to prevent that resolution from being passed. So we can assess the actions of the United States in the following way. In the first place, the United States is clearly in breach of the Geneva Conventions of 1949, which in Article 1 require all states to ensure respect for the Geneva Conventions. The United States has not attempted to ensure that Israel respects international humanitarian law. It has exerted no influence to stop Israel's violations of international humanitarian law, and on occasion it has even encouraged Israel's violations of international humanitarian law. Here one thinks of the continued indirect support that the United States gives to the construction of settlements and its obstruction of any action being taken by the United Nations against Israel over Operation Cast Lead and more recently over the Pillar of Defense operation. Secondly, under international law, a state that aids or assists another state in the commission of an international crime itself becomes internationally responsible, and the United States has assisted Israel in the commission of many international wrongs, international crimes such as war crimes and crimes against humanity. And finally, there's the question of good faith. Members of the United Nations are required in terms of Article 2 of the Charter to fulfill their obligations under the Charter in good faith. And it's quite clear that the United States, by obstructing action against Israel, particularly in the Quartet, has violated its good faith obligation. Turning now to the United Nations, we find that the history of the United Nations is a history of failure to take action against Israel's violations of international law and complicity in these actions. For instance, the United Nations has consistently allowed, by its inaction, allowed Israel to violate international law with impunity. It has failed in many respects. It has failed to secure the return of Palestinian refugees. It has failed to find a humane solution to the refugee problem. It has failed to secure the return of land occupied by Israel since 1967. It has acquiesced in the construction of a colonial settlement empire in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. It is extraordinary that there has been no response from the United Nations to the recent attempt on the part of Israel to expand its settlements in the E1 area outside Ma'ale Adumim. And there's also been no response to the recent Human Rights Council fact-finding mission condemning settlements. So the United Nations clearly sees itself as powerless to act, largely because of the United States veto. Furthermore, the United Nations has also failed to comply with the 2004 advisory opinion. It is an advisory opinion, which means that it is not binding upon states, but it is binding upon the United Nations because the United Nations has adopted this advisory opinion. But the United Nations has made no attempt through the Quartet to ensure compliance with the advisory opinion, and I think here one must blame to a large extent the Secretary General, who is the representative of the United Nations in the quartet, and he has failed abysmally in this respect. The United Nations has also failed to ensure compliance with international law. It took no action in respect of Operation Cast Lead, whereas it has referred some other situations, such as in the case of Darfur and Libya, to the International Criminal Court for action. It has been unable to do so in the case of Palestine. Finally, the United Nations has failed to promote the self-determination of the Palestinian people. The mandate of 1920 obliged the League of Nations to advance the sacred trust of civilization of the mandated territory of Palestine. And that obligation was inherited by the United Nations. But the United Nations has failed for over 50 years to give effect to this sacred trust. It has failed to recognize the full independence of Palestine by admitting it as a full member to the United Nations. Fortunately, last November, it did go some way in this direction by accepting the non-member observer status of Palestine. But it still remains to be seen when Palestine will become a full member of the United Nations. International organizations, like states, incur international responsibility for wrongful acts, and it's quite clear that the United Nations, by its inaction, incurs international responsibility. It's unlikely that any legal action will be taken against the United Nations, but I think that the failure of the United Nations, and this is essentially what the tribunal found, that the failure of the United Nations to act to protect the Palestinian people is a serious indictment of the United Nations and has resulted in the loss of the moral high ground as far as the United Nations is concerned. Let me conclude by saying that we know that President Obama will visit the Palestinian territory and Israel later this month. This brings me, or recalls, an incident in February 1990. President de Klerk of South Africa was about to give a major speech, and I was asked to predict what he would say the next day. And I said, he won't say anything, he'll probably move to the right. Now, I was hopelessly wrong. That was the speech that President de Klerk gave, which led to the end of apartheid. I have no expectation that President Obama will say anything like this, but I hope that I am wrong again. Thank you.